Thank you for joining the In the Know podcast series. In this series, you'll be hearing from a wide variety of brilliant minds around the world to talk about a range of topics to foster learning, inspiration, and innovation, and provoke conversations that can dictate the future of sport and exercise medicine. So give us a like, follow us on our social media channels to stay informed. Today, we have Dr. Tracya Blake joining us. Non-discrimination is one of the founding pillars of the Olympic movement. Tracya is a leader in this field, and she is the only Black titled sport physiotherapist in Canada, and she's working on many platforms advocating for racial justice. So she's the perfect person to have a conversation about racial justice, non-discrimination, and why sidelines are no longer an option in sport and exercise medicine. My name is Nirmala Perera, and I'm your host. Welcome to the podcast, Tracya.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I wish to recognize the outstanding contributions that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make to sports in Australia and to celebrate the power of sport to promote reconciliation and reduce inequity.
I would like to acknowledge the lands on which I currently reside. I am coming to you tonight from Toronto, Canada, also known as Turtle Island, on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat peoples.
So Tracya, I'm always fascinated to learn about people's journeys. By way of introduction, can you give us an idea about your path?
Sure. I am the daughter of Trinidadian immigrants. I was born in Toronto. I come from sports-loving people. I have two brothers on either side of me, and both of my parents are quite physically active and sports lovers as well. So I grew up with sports as an integral part of my life. I tore my ACL playing soccer when I was just past my 18th birthday, and that was my introduction to physiotherapy as a profession. And that sort of started the juices running in my head. So I worked towards that while I was in university, got into physio school as a master's program, and then going into my second year, so my final year of physiotherapy school was the year that Vancouver was granted the 2010 Olympic Games. And so that really solidified not only what did I have a goal, I had a deadline for said goal. And I've sort of been chasing it ever since.
Can you tell us a little bit about what key choices you made?
Well, I think maybe the first choice might have been the school that I went to. So by going to McMaster University, it also happened to be the alma mater of the medical liaison, Doug Stacey, for the Canadian women's national hockey team. So he was the Canadian women's national hockey team therapist, the junior hockey team therapist, and the therapist of a very good junior OHL team at the time, the London Knights. So he was the person that you wanted to be if you wanted to do sports. And when he came to school to talk to us, he said that you will never get a sniff at the Olympics unless you have your diploma in sport physiotherapy, unless you have your advanced orthopedic practice, and unless you have your level 1 acupuncture. And so I came out of the gate of school really focused on getting those credentials, since I knew that there was no way I was going to magically make there be more than 5 years till the Olympics. I wanted to make sure I was as qualified as possible. I also think that maybe actually the first key choice when it came to, that was my first key choice when it came to sport physio, but my first key choice when it came to sport as a therapy or exploring that role was volunteering in my undergrad and working with the university varsity football program and basketball program. And having one of my best friends in university, Laura Clark, that was our love, right? Like, was working with the team and working with the boys, and working in my case also with the girls. So the women's basketball team is the one I worked with, and really getting to dig our feet into and dig our heels into what that life could be like and what it felt like. And I guess the third choice for me was the third choice for me was the decision to go back to school and do my PhD. At the time, it was just a matter of wanting to understand more about concussion and not seeing the questions that I had as a clinician reflected in the literature at that time. So this would have been, I started my PhD in 2011. And so going back to really discover more about the process of how to ask the right question, how to read the literature to make sure you're gleaning the right information, and how to sort of construct a project that reflected the questions that I wanted answers to. And that was my introduction also to population and public health. So the idea of health inequity and health equity, and how those played into both a clinical and a research pathway was sort of introduced to me there. And I've tried to integrate and learn more and relearn in some cases more about how the population health model and approach applies to sport, and sport physiotherapy specifically ever since.
That's great. In a nutshell, can you tell us key findings from your PhD?
So the key findings from my PhD, so I looked at the relationship between physical activity and concussion in youth ice hockey players. So youth ice hockey I looked at was 11 years old to 17 years old. And what I did, it was the first study to look at how do public health recommendations for physical activity. So in Canada, what those are is an hour a day of physical activity. How does the 6 weeks prior to joining the studies, if kids were getting that level of physical activity or not, does that impact or is that associated in any way with incidence of concussion? And so what I found was that in the 11 and 12-year-olds, that 11 and 12-year-olds who didn't get at least an hour a day of physical activity for the 6 weeks leading into their study involvement, they had concussion incidence rates of more than 3 times that of 11 and 12-year-olds who had an average of 1 hour a day. In 13 and 14-year-olds, it was more than twice the concussion incidence rate in those who did not make the physical activity recommendations. And there was no difference in 15 to 17-year-olds between those who hit the physical activity recommendations and those who did not.
Yeah, very interesting findings, and shows the importance of physical activity. And you mentioned about your goal was to go into the Olympics, and you were going to go to the 2020 Tokyo, which will be now in 2021. Can you tell us a little bit
Yes.
around what does it mean to go into the Olympics for the first time? Because it's been a long journey for you.
Yeah, I think, it's an interesting thing to be in a position that I am very comfortable in, which is the background. As my team will tell you, I am forever dodging a camera. I prefer it that way. But I also take great joy and great pleasure in serving athletes that way. In optimizing athlete health, yes, athlete function, yes, but also athlete performance. And I think that I always say that I was an artist before I was a scientist. I started playing music before I started school, and my brain is wired in a bit of an artistic way. And I find that sport really allows me to express both the art and science of my profession. But at the same time, at the highest level of sport, it also absolutely kicks in every competitive juice I have, right? What can I do? How can I help them to be the best that they can against the best athletes of the world, right? How can you be the best athlete that you are against the best athletes of the world, or in the world, excuse me? And I love the idea of being able to contribute to a group who's trying to make that happen, and to put my skills up in that context. So hopefully we'll get to the opportunity for all of their hard work to really be pit against the best of the best at the biggest show in the world. So that's the hope, is that I get to watch it happen from the good seats.
That'll be amazing. And there's so much hope overcoming the pandemics and celebrating as a global community. So that will be amazing. Given that this podcast goes out to a wide range of audiences, do you have any tips for people, particularly for those people from Black and ethnic minority groups who want to work in high performance or professional sports? Because it is competitive, and there's a lot of evidence showing that it's even harder if you are from a Black and ethnic minority background. So
yeah, I think it's important to remember that you never just hop into high performance, right? So I've been lucky in that right now I'm working with the Canadian men's national volleyball team, and I worked for years with the women's national basketball team program, but I also covered community events. I also covered community rugby. I think I've done, it's something like over 30 events covering over 25 sports at everything from the local to the international level. And so all of those experiences inform the work that I'm doing in this particular job. So there is no volunteer opportunity that's too small. There's no job, it doesn't even have to be volunteer. Pay, like I covered like Australian rules football that I had literally never seen live in my life. And as I walked down to the field, I literally walked into the middle of a fight. And so you got to figure it out. I've had to learn how to do a boarding for a spinal cord injury patient. Yes, I've done it on the field. Yes, I've done it on the ice. I've also had to learn how to do it on a trampoline. Right? So those experiences all inform how you approach situations, the comfort that you have, the skill sets that you develop, and how those skill sets transfer. It's really important. Networking also really matters. As you said, sport is incredibly competitive, particularly as you get into the higher levels. A lot of jobs are either not posted, and the ones that are posted, particularly for me at the pro level, I don't think I've applied for a job that has had less than, I think I looked the other day, 160 people is the lowest number. It's usually closer to an average in the like 2 to 300 range. These are incredibly competitive positions, and it's not going to be for lack of qualifications, right? There are going to be a lot of qualified people applying, so you need to find some way to set yourself apart. And people having some knowledge of you ahead of time, some knowledge of your work, is helpful in that regard. And I think maybe the third one is that it's an interesting place to be as a sport physio, because you're trained in a healthcare paradigm, but you work in sport, you're working in a sport paradigm, which is performance, right? We are not trained in performance when we're in school. So there's a level of humility that you have to have about learning, but also a level of, you have to have a true north that's internal. Because when you add that level of competition, when you add the fact that people are going to have metrics for success that may differ from yours, in order to make sure that you continue to do right by the athlete, that your athlete's protection of athlete health and welfare remains top of mind, you really need to make sure that your internal barometer for that is strong and functioning properly and recalibrated often.
Yeah, thanks. That's great advice, and it seems to be something that's coming through. No opportunity is too small. Get out there and have a crack. Hopefully, people like Tracy can be examples that.
Yeah, and I want to say to your point about Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Oh, sorry.
No.
I think to your point about that is that those things that seem like barriers, I've had a lot of privilege in my career in that I have a family that supports that. In that I had student loans, yes, but I worked in such a way that allowed me to pay them off. I didn't have to work a full-time job when I was in school, for example. So you have to find a way, like, don't put a time frame on it, particularly if you are part of a racialized community. Don't put a time frame on it that is somebody else's. Do what works for you and your life first. I think that's really important, because otherwise it's super easy to get caught up in somebody else's product when you're working on your own process.
Yeah, because there are like not that many people that looks like us, rather than looking for a people.
Yeah, so again, like if there's only one, right, it's not like I'm going to be like, oh, just wait for somebody who looks like me to figure out what they're doing. I looked for people who had the jobs that I wanted, who are working in the opportunities that I wanted. What are skills? You got to use your imagination a little bit, right? So what are skills that Doug Stacy who had that I would like to get, right? That I can work on developing. What are skills that Amy Arundel has? What are skills that Alex McKechnie has, right? There's obviously a lot of basketball in my life. I quite love it. But what are skills that those people who are in the jobs that I want, what are they demonstrating? I listen to all of the interviews. I watch all of the talks to glean that information, right? And then as you grow in your professional self, you'll also understand what your strengths are. You'll understand for the sport that you're interested in, for example. Maybe you're super interested in working in professional rugby. Listen to the podcasts related to rugby injuries. Listen to what the ownership and the executives who are making the decisions about hiring, how do they talk about rugby? What are the language that they use? All of that is information that's available to you, right? Don't limit it just by what you can see that is literally exactly like you. Use your imagination as to what is valuable and where you can find it. I think that becomes a huge component, is work your way backwards from the goal, not just working your way from who you are forward.
That's fantastic advice for anybody. Grab every opportunity, with both hands, and that belief that you can do it.
I think it's Nelson Mandela, I believe. Nelson Mandela, who said that I win or I learn, I never lose, right? And I think that's a huge thing, is failure is not get out of the game. Failure is another lesson. And so how are you going to use that lesson going forward? There's a consistency and a persistence that's required to work in sport. It's not for the faint of heart.
Thanks, Tracy. Now let's shift focus a little bit to your BJSM editorial titled "In the Fight for Racial Justice, the Sidelines Are No Longer an Option." So in the wake of COVID-19 and with George Floyd's death, sparked a global protest around systemic racism, highlighting the intersection between two pandemics, COVID-19 and racism. So events like this force us to hold a mirror to ourselves and reflect who we are, our values, and what really matters to us. It is 2020. We are strong enough and evolved enough to have these uncomfortable conversations around racial injustice and inequity, about who we are in practice and where we belong in the world, and what kind of world we want and how we can carve a path forward. So can you explain how COVID-19 exposed inequity in sports and exercise medicine?
I think there's a couple of things, and they mostly revolve around, one of the things that COVID did is that it dissolved the idea that anybody lives in isolation, right? We don't live in isolation from each other, but industries are also not separate from each other. We're interconnected in many more ways than I think that we were willing to accept. We are collective in many more ways. Particularly, I'm from the Western Hemisphere, so that idea of like pick yourself up by your own bootstraps and sort yourself out is very prominent. But we are a collective in ways that our infrastructure is no longer built to support. And the behavior that is reinforced is not built to support. And I think one of the biggest things for sport and exercise medicine is the simple part is who got laid off, right? Like, how was our value seen by the organization? How many therapists do I know, or people in sport and exercise medicine were furloughed during this time or laid off altogether, right? When it comes to, at a time where we're having a public health crisis, you remove your entire medical staff, right? It just goes to show where you're valued and then who actually is really making the decisions in that case. I think another thing is around athletes, for example, who have previous health conditions, right? There are a lot of sports that you are actually able to practice within the constructs of some sort of return to training strategy, like where it can line up. Let's say, for example, runners You could probably do it marathoners or cyclists. Golf, I believe, is one of the first sports where you can actually maintain the public policies at the same time as competing and training in your sport. But I work in an indoor sport, right? I work in a sport where 6 feet of separate physical distancing is not possible. I work on a sport that is sweaty and gross. So it is considered a high-risk sport. And in a time or in a sport that is usually like it's non-contact, like it would not be considered high risk at any other time. So how do you adjust and adapt? And can you adjust and adapt? That's also exposed. With the previous history of conditions, I think of Elena Deladon, where she has medical recommendations, where she has a medically recognized condition and was rejected when she applied for medical exemption from playing in the WNBA season this year. How is that possible? Who's overriding the medical advice, not only for her team, but for her outside doctors as well, her community doctors? And so I think all of those are examples of how inequity can show up. Who has the power to make decisions about health? Why are those decisions about health made? And who ends up bearing the brunt of the burden of those decisions? Something else that ties in is also like testing. So we're getting all of these sports are going back, but where are the tests coming from? Who's not getting tested? How are those testing results being handled? And is that handling of them, if there is a positive test, how does that differ than what is either recommended in public policy or possible in public policy? So I think all of those things are things that are being exposed right now that we're going to have to get a handle on as the weeks and months go by.
Yeah, and what is the value of diverse voices being represented in power structure of sport and sports medicine?
I really thought about this question. And for me, I think really representation is just the degree to which a group represents the larger group, either the larger group that they are members of or the larger group that they're leading, right? And why anyone should actually care about that is because, again, we all come from very specific social locations. We cannot see or be everything to all people. And so the more representation we have as a group, the more able we are to cover each other's blind spots as we were. And able to do that, then we're able to sort of catch a larger amount of people more sustainably and effectively. So even something as simple for us, for example, as making sure that we talk about athletes, we are talking about both able-bodied athletes and athletes with disabilities, right? Remembering that when we're talking about athletes, that we're not just talking about cisgendered athletes, that we might be actually talking about athletes who have multiple areas of disadvantage, disadvantage or oppression, right? Athletes who are both people of color and who have physical disabilities, right? How are the inequities that have been exposed during COVID amplified for those athletes? And I think it's a hard thing to do at any point, but if you're trying to do it all by yourself, you're bound to fail, right? But if we can do it as a collective, where what you have is a representation of the group, what you have is a representation making the decisions around what's best for the group, you're more likely to have somebody be like, I realize you think that's a good idea, but there's this entire section of people who are left out. There's this entire section of people we haven't talked about yet. This is going to work for 3 of our groups, but we're going to have to come up with a separate policy for groups 4 and 5, right? Like there's no way to do that alone in a way that's effective for the whole or sustainable for the person. And I think that kind of work, this kind of work, that's certainly, that's the advantage of representation, is that it actually allows us to be more effective for more people and be more agile to change.
And that leads really nicely into my next question. We always advocate for evidence-based, person-centered, holistic clinical practice. But currently most of the research that's published underrepresent a lot of the minority groups? And what are the challenges to actually provide evidence-based, person-centered, holistic care?
You always have to interpret the evidence, right? The way in which evidence is produced is very artificial compared to, or often quite artificial compared to the way in which it's applied. And so critical appraisal skills are important. Generalizability is a huge component of that, right? So how much of what is happening in this manufactured situation that research is conducted in is applicable to the wildly unpredictable, highly variable life that I'm living? And so transparency around who your population is will help me understand how representative it is of the population I work in. And that will also help me to understand and have a better gauge about my expectations for what the effectiveness of your of the intervention might be, and also help me manage the expectations of the athletes and the other stakeholders that I'm working with to implement that intervention. So if, for example, let's take FIFA 11 plus, right? If there are 3 studies that use the FIFA 11 plus, and I'm the therapist that's working with a women's CP soccer team in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, right? And I look at the study, and the study doesn't say anything about the population that is included in this study population, then I don't know if they're able-bodied or no. I don't know if the socioeconomic status matches the one that I'm currently working in. I don't know if the racial representation is the same as what I'm working in. And we know that race and the experience of being racialized directly impacts access to healthcare. And so if I'm asking people to do a thing, and then that follow-up or the outcome for that thing is happening outside of a study constructed context, that means I'm going to depend on community-based healthcare and all of the variance that comes therein for my outcomes and its success. So I need to understand the logistics of that and the context of that to make my decisions, not just of whether I'm going to use it or not, but how many changes need to be made before it's no longer the same, and what the implementation plan expectations are around that.
Yeah, and when you are treating somebody with the ACL injury or a hamstring injury, there's also impact in the treatment and management.
Yeah, and I mean, even if, like I said, like if I wasn't doing it in Calgary, it'd be one thing. If I was doing it in Iqaluit, which is in our far north in Canada, access to healthcare, period, is incredibly difficult. What are the cultural norms around the relationship between a practitioner and a patient? How do all of those things play into getting the effective information that we need, right? So having a study that comes out of Norway, having a study whose population is Nigeria, having a study whose population is Brazil, having a study whose population is Montana in the US. It's not that I need to understand everything about every population, but I just need to understand how much of the context is available to help me contextualize that information to my own situation.
So let's talk about your BJSM editorial. In there you wrote, I quote, "Racism will not fade into obscurity and irrelevance simply by people not being racist. It must be addressed through intentionally anti-racist actions." You call for change from macro level as well as micro level. Can you share some example of intentionally anti-racist actions?
I think it's important, for example, to have policies that explicitly talk about, to explicitly note and mention race. right? It's not okay to assume that race is going to, people will automatically assume that race will be covered. So for example, there are outcome measures in which you can use to measure people's anxiety around racial discrimination in a healthcare context. That's one. There are ways of getting consent that are respectful of different cultural practices around expertise, different historical context around whether consent was even something that happened with particular racial groups, right? Is informed consent enough, or do we also need to talk about informed refusal? How do you chart that? How do you record that? How do you report that? Who owns people's data, right? We talk about bodily autonomy often, but do we talk about data autonomy and data sovereignty, especially in the digital age, especially when studies are really advocating for data sharing and open access data? Who owns the data? There are real cultural implications for that for many groups, right? One of the things I think of often as a clinician is that there is an inherent power imbalance already for me as a clinician in a provider-patient relationship. And it is my responsibility ethically to try and create as equitable an environment to basically adjust the scales as much as is possible for me to create an environment where the patient isn't just somebody I'm working on, they're somebody I'm working with. And so how do you do that in a situation? And what happens is that it's often not, like when things are going well, it goes fine. But it's when the athlete or the patient doesn't agree with you. Have you cultivated an environment where they are comfortable disagreeing, where they're comfortable providing their own information, where they're comfortable exerting their power in a situation that may be a counter to what you believe should happen? That's where the rubber meets the road, right? And so can you do that? And then there's the policy level, right? Are you creating do you have a reporting and remedy structure in your organization for racist behavior? Do you have ways of evaluating whether whatever the policy that it is you made, whether it's effective or not? How do you check in? How do you reevaluate, reassess, and readjust? So I think those are all things that everyone can kind of work on depending on where they are in the organization, and hold each other accountable. Even if you're not the person making the policy, you can always ask for one. You can always ask to see it. You can always like ask people how it's working and how it's going. You don't need to be the person making it to be the person that's influencing it.
Yeah, that's great. About accountability and action, because systematic change does not happen overnight, and doors has to be open to help people from underrepresented communities to move from sidelines to the center court. You had some great examples there. We talk about diversity, inequity, equity, parity. There's so many different language around that. And can you talk around the language, and because diversity is only a tool in this process?
Yeah, I think so. For me, this has been an evolution for myself as well, to be clear. And the reason why I put racial justice in the title of the BJSM piece was because justice for me is the goal. It's not about whether I'm helped or whether we can help people who are racialized manage or navigate a system that is oppressive or a system that is unjust. It's about, can we dismantle the system altogether, right? And so for me, that is the goal that I have my eyes on the prize of. And so equity is the next closest thing. So in my mind, equity is parity and access to outcomes, right? So that requires a power change, right? I don't get to set the outcomes of success for somebody else or for another group. No one can set them for me. And then what you get is the resources that you need to achieve that outcome, whatever those resources are. Inclusion is also interesting in that regard, then, that is also a function of power. So inclusion is merely creating and cultivating an environment where somebody's presence is not enough. It's where their presence is also backed by an ability to contribute, right? You're not just a head count that you belong to the group, and you're able to contribute regardless of what you're contributing is aligned with the group or the majority thinking or no. So equity and inclusion are functions of power. Diversity and equality are functions of math. So diversity is really, can we switch up who's in the room, right? That's where you might get your representation from a demographic perspective or from a racialized perspective, but you're not necessarily by itself. Diversity, racial diversity by itself won't necessarily get you a function in power, a change in the power distribution. It requires inclusion as well, which is why you often hear them together, right? Diversity without inclusion gives rise to tokenism. Inclusion without diversity gives rise to an echo chamber. A lot of powerful people who are all the same, everybody just says the same thing, right? Equality is parity and access to resources, right? Where everybody gets the same amount, regardless of whether everybody needs the same amount or regardless of what everybody needs it for, right? In terms of the resource or opportunity. And so a lot of this comes out of Dr. Kamara Jones's work on levels of racism, but the idea that power is the ability to utilize or allocate resources and opportunity. What we're trying to do is make that that distribution of power as free as possible and not have it be dependent on or bottlenecked based on different racial categories. That for me is the outcome that I'm looking for, not diversity. Diversity is a tool that we can use on the path to get there. Equity is a tool that we can use on the path to get there, but really what I want is the dismantling of the system that's causing the bottleneck in power to begin with.
Yep. Do you have any examples of what will progress look like?
I think there's been a couple of interesting things that have been happening. So, for example, it turns out that there are no standards on reporting racial inequities in research. So how can you ask people to be consistent when you're not clear, right? How can we ask them to be transparent, but not give them standards to which to hold to their transparency up to? So Dr. Rhea Boyd and colleagues recently put forth a list of recommendations and standards with how to report racial inequities and health inequities. And I think that'll be important. I think policy change is inherently important, which we've talked about before. Creating situations like justice is going to be a collective effort, right? But what can I do for justice is I can try and create more equitable conditions. So, for example, with patient voices, in the beginning, Dr. Osman Ahmed and I were we were soliciting personally each contributor. And at the time, we were really paying attention to, we realized that we had some issues in terms of, obviously, our connections. We are Western Hemisphere, sort of global North, high-income countries. But looking at racial diversity, looking at gender diversity, we were sort of paying attention to that. But as the contributors started to self-submit, then those numbers changed drastically. And so we realized that there was a couple of things that we needed to be much more explicit in how we select, but also change the way we present the information so that it was more accessible to a broader swath of people. And so that's what we're working on now. As a clinician, again, policy. So writing down and having it in accessible language, and ideally, like, for example, I work in a country that has 2 official languages. So having those policies in multiple languages, having the languages that you have your information in reflects the communities you work in is a really good way, right? Providing people who perhaps aren't as comfortable with English in a medical context, being okay with them having somebody come in for translating, right? Providing it if you can, but if not, then having them come in and think about it. Realizing that people make decisions as a collective and not as an individual. And so not holding them to a standard that works counter to the way their community works. So that all falls under sort of culturally competent and culturally safe practices. And I heard this term today, but the idea of humility in practice, whether it is in a leadership position, whether it is as a clinician, as an individual, being open to change, being open to feedback, being open to learning, in some cases unlearning, in some cases relearning, what needs to happen in order to heighten and to improve your service. That's what this is about, right? Is whether we're in research in sport and exercise medicine or education or clinical care, what we're here to do is serve athletes and to facilitate athlete health, welfare, safety, performance in whatever our role is in. And so we need to always be open to whatever the opportunities are, and provide them a space where they could share that. I'm not sure if that altogether answered your question, but there you go.
Thank you, Tracy. I think that there is a lot to think about, and I think that's a nice way to wrap up the podcast. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here, and it is also nice to see that some of these things are starting to cut through and these conversations are happening. And I have no doubt that our listeners will get a lot out of this podcast. If you have any questions for Tracy, she's on Twitter, so send her a tweet, and I'm sure Tracy is quite happy to share some of those resources that she mentioned. If you missed this podcast or if you want to rewatch it, you can look at the replay on Twitter, Facebook, or on YouTube, and you can listen to the audio on our SoundCloud. Please forward this to any colleague you think would gain value from watching it. And also, if you enjoyed our podcast, or if you have any ideas for future podcasts, want to suggest speakers, you can do so through our social media platforms. Also, just a little reminder that the IOC World Conference in Prevention of Injury and Illness is now calling for abstracts, and the deadline is 1st of October. So just have a look at the website and submit your research, especially if you are conducting research in those minority communities. This would be a great chance to showcase that work. So take this opportunity and submit your work too. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and thank you for listening. So let's go and make some ripples. Thank you so much again, Tracy.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.